Our dependence on connected technology is growing faster than our ability to secure it, especially in areas affecting public safety and human life.
I'm Bryson Bort, and this is Hack the Plant. Electricity, finance, transportation, our water supply. We take these critical infrastructure systems for granted, but they're all becoming increasingly dependent on the internet to function. Every day, I ask and look for answers to the questions. Does our connectivity leave us more vulnerable to attacks by our enemies? I'm a senior fellow at the R Street Institute and the co-founder of the nonprofit ICS Village, educating people on critical infrastructure security with hands-on examples, not just nerd stuff. I founded Grim in 2013, a consultancy that works the front lines of these problems every day for clients all over the world.
It's playing out in Israel right now, where hackers have been going after Israeli water systems. Again, not to steal information from them, but to change the setting on the chemicals in Israeli water.
Each month, I'm going to walk you through my world of hackers, insiders, and government, working on the front lines of cybersecurity and public safety to protect the systems you rely upon every day.
If you think that the small town water authorities and the mom and pop sized companies have better cybersecurity in the US than the Israelis do, I have really, really bad news for you.
An attack on our critical infrastructure, the degradation to the point that they can no longer support us, means that we go back to the Stone Age literally overnight.
If we think the government's going to solve it for us, we're wrong. We have to help them.
This is not a podcast for the faint of heart. If you want to meet those protecting the world and what problems keep them up at night, then this is the podcast for you. I'm Bryson Bort, and this is Hack the Plant. For today's episode, I'm joined by Megan Culler and Keith Mecham of Idaho National Labs, also known as INL. INL is a federally funded research and development center, an FFRDC. These are public-private partnerships which conduct research and development for the U.S. government. They have the largest federally owned wind project, which provides both full-scale power as well as engineering and development support to a variety of federal agencies using renewable power. Megan is a power engineer and researcher at INL. Keith is a critical infrastructure cybersecurity engineer. Today, we discuss how wind fits within our broader energy infrastructure.
Wind energy is one of the most rapidly growing generation sources in the U.S., and it's a critical part of being able to meet carbon neutral and clean energy goals that are being set by the government, that are being set by businesses. Wind energy resource potential is very high. If we were able to capture all of the wind in the U.S., we'd be able to power the U.S. needs 3 times over.
We also explore the key challenges of keeping these energy systems secure.
Wind energy is also far more distributed and diverse than other forms of energy production. So because there are tens of different manufacturers of major wind systems and different types of installations are being put in all over the country, there's going to be a considerable effort to make sure that all of these systems are up to standards and are safe and secure. So I think we're just in an evolutionary point. We've seen already, the startup companies come in and build their wind farms and get a foothold in the door. We've seen large companies start to invest in large wind farms, and we're getting significant amounts of our energy from wind now that we didn't even 5 or 10 years ago. The next step is that wind and solar together become a much larger part of our energy portfolio, and naturally increased requirements from regulating bodies are going to come into play. And the industry itself is learning a lot about how to operate and what the risks may be.
And just in the news, Vestas, a Danish wind energy company, was hit by ransomware to their IT systems on 19 November, but wind turbine and supply chain operations were unaffected. An International Energy Agency report last year noted that cyber attacks would be a key threat to wind power and other renewable power sources. How can energy systems stay resilient in the face of cyber attacks as the industry grows? What core challenges does the industry have in maintaining security? What regulatory shifts might need to be made? Join us as we discuss these questions and more.
Starting point. Please tell me about what is Idaho National Labs?
Idaho National Laboratory is a Department of Energy national research laboratory with a focus on nuclear and other energy for the most part. Also a lot of critical infrastructure security, and it's really a wide variety of topics that are covered, but the key part, I guess, is that it's not industry and it's not academia, and we focus on problems that can't or are not solved by industry with the goal of helping industry get to those solutions faster.
Keith, anything you want to add?
Yeah, INL is the premier research lab in the DOE complex for nuclear research and future nuclear technologies. But we are also extremely strong in cybersecurity research as well as services. We service a lot of DOE and Department of Homeland Security programs to secure critical infrastructure. These include things like power plants and wastewater treatment, even manufacturing, and things we rely on every day that are important to the security of our nation and people's livelihoods is about a fourth of the focus of INL. About a fourth of the staff here are dedicated to that. So wind energy is becoming a big part of that as well.
Yeah, so we heard nuclear twice and then wind energy there at the end. Tell us, what is wind energy?
Wind energy is a form of power generation. The blades spin and they turn a generator. There are some converters on the inside that change the blade speed, which can be highly variable, to the 60 hertz power that you would get in your wall. Wind energy can be in many sizes, so we can have, individual turbines powering a farm or something like that, up to multi-gigawatt wind farms, both onshore and offshore. So one of the challenges with the wind energy is that it's not specific to a particular size or technology. There's a wide range of things to consider there.
So why do we care about wind energy?
Wind energy is one of the most rapidly growing generation sources in the U.S. I don't have the numbers in front of me, and maybe I should have, but it's being installed rapidly both at the distributed scale, so smaller projects that are powering individual communities, up to, as we've seen a lot recently in the news, big offshore farms. And it's a critical part of being able to meet carbon neutral and clean energy goals that are being set by the government, that are being set by businesses. Wind energy resource potential is very high. If we were able to capture all of the wind in the U.S., we'd be able to power the U.S. needs 3 times over. So really, it's trying to capture that energy and use it most effectively, get it from where the wind is blowing to where the power is consumed.
I would add that wind energy is also far more distributed and diverse than other forms of energy production. So because there are tens of different manufacturers of major wind systems and different types of installations are being put in all over the country, there's going to be a considerable effort to make sure that all of these systems are up to standards and are safe and secure.
Your primary focus at INL is in cybersecurity. What is unique about the cybersecurity requirements with wind energy?
So first of all, because wind farms are distributed, you have hundreds of individual endpoints, the wind turbines themselves, and those endpoints have to connect to a management network, which we associate with a plant or a wind plant or wind farm. And all the different wind farms then have to connect to our electrical grid in order to get power to where it's needed and service, the load and the requirements. So instead of having, one big nuclear plant or some massive hydroelectric dams serving a region, or even large coal or natural gas plants, instead you'll have thousands of windmills serving that load. And coordinating, thousands of endpoints is a lot more difficult than a couple of major power plants. And it offers a larger attack surface area for adversaries and is a lot more complex to manage and get them working, especially where we're not in control of the prime motivator, the wind itself. The control algorithms, the control effort is more difficult because we have to just take what's there and utilize it. We can't control how hard the wind's blowing and where it's blowing. So the infrastructure for controls to make a wind energy system, efficient and effective, it's a big deal. And because there's more electronics, more control, the attack surface is greater. And we definitely need to focus on making sure that all the wind farms and even individual wind, micro generation, make sure they're secure.
What kind of projects are you working on at INL currently on that?
We have projects that are working with particular vendors and manufacturers to evaluate the security of those products individually. We have larger projects where we're looking to provide guidance to the wind industry in the form of cybersecurity guides and resilience guides. We have a long history of work in resilient controls. And one of the things that we like to stress with power energy in particular is that, you're not going to be 100% secure. There's just too many variables to control. So instead, what we want to do is make sure that we are resilient in the face of threats, that we have backup systems in place, that there are safety systems to make sure that the physical and safety impacts are minimal. And we want to try to protect the power system. We want to protect the safety of the engineers who might be working on the system. And we want to protect the equipment itself. So with security, we're not necessarily trying to say that we're 100% secure. That's just not possible, as Keith mentioned, with the hundreds of endpoints and the amount of controls and communications that's required for that. But instead, we want to make sure that we can monitor the systems, that we know when something is happening, and that we can fail gracefully or provide resilience so that in the face of these threats, the impact to the system is low.
Are there any particular projects or exercises that you can go into detail on?
Sure. One of the projects that I've been working on for about a year is called Miracle. That's Microgrid's Infrastructure Resilience and Advanced Controls Launchpad. And the focus of that project is on distributed wind. So by that, we mean wind that is producing power that is consumed locally. So as opposed to big wind farms in Texas that are up in the northwest part of the state, but producing power for the major load centers in the southeast part of the state. When we talk about distributed wind, we mean things that are consumed more, power that's consumed more locally. So for that project in particular, we've been working with other national labs, including Sandia National Labs, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory to develop resilience metrics, cybersecurity metrics, advanced controls that can be used to promote more adoption of distributed wind. So in particular, INL's focus there has been on producing the resilience and cybersecurity metrics, and we've produced guides that have been based on case studies that we've performed to identify which wind plant stakeholders are responsible for certain parts of security and resilience, and to help those groups monitor and improve their resilience.
Keith, any projects or exercises that you can share detail on beyond Miracle or your own work on Miracle?
I I can generically share some of the types of work we do without naming like a direct entity. But in contrast to projects like Miracle, at INL we also work on evaluating the cybersecurity and quality of individual control devices, all the way down to programmable controllers such as PLCs or embedded devices that control aspects of the wind turbine. So we really take a holistic approach. We evaluate systems and the interconnection of systems, across the power grid, but we also work with vendors and manufacturers to evaluate the systems that they're putting into the field at a lower level. What kind of vulnerabilities might exist in them? What kind of software libraries are they using, and do those inherit some risk because of things that they've built in or hardware that they perhaps are using that has some known vulnerabilities. We try to encompass that work as well, and that has been partly my focus is working on that lower level stuff where you've got a hardware controller and you can understand how it communicates or what the parts are inside. Is it secure, or would it be really easy for me to spoof communication to that if I could get onto the network? And how would that device react? Could I take control of it? What harm could I do? So that's really a big focus of our work here at the lab as well.
Do we have any real world visibility on threats or actors that we've seen that have attempted to take advantage of things like this?
Yeah, so there have been several academic studies that have evaluated the security of individual wind turbines and wind plants overall. But there have also been some real world examples of wind plants or wind systems either being hit or being targeted, which can be slightly different. But to give a couple examples, one of the most well-known ones was a attack on Cisco firewalls on a renewable company that managed solar and wind devices in Utah. And this attack caused the firewalls to reboot over and over again for about 12 hours. And while it didn't impact the ability of the wind turbines to produce energy, it did block visibility for the operators into the system, so they could not see what was going on real time or make changes. Some other interesting examples. In 2018, there was an incident where a technician logged onto a laptop in a hotel, accidentally downloaded some malware, went to work the next day, plugged his maintenance computer into the wind turbine controls, and the wind plant became infected and the turbine stopped running. Now, there are other examples of attacks like that, and those aren't necessarily things that have been targeted towards wind energy. It's more likely that it was just malware that interfered with the systems so much that they couldn't work. In particular, there are many controllers that are Windows-based, so any Windows vulnerabilities could potentially be exploited to make those controllers stop working. But if we still had good security on all of these devices, we might not run into that. Just kind of these drive-by attacks, if you want to call it that. There have been a few more targeted attacks. There was an example in 2014 of an unknown hacker using some masking software to get into a plant. They changed a setting on a single turbine, but there weren't any widespread power effects from that change. And there was also an example of some Russian hackers getting into a particular wind plant. And again, their reach appeared to be fairly limited. It didn't have any widespread power effects. But I think the main takeaway from a lot of these incidents is just kind of if you have good cyber hygiene, which is hard to find in the industrial control system world, that some of these could have been prevented. So we are interested and we care about the specific things that can be done to target wind controllers. But we also note that there probably aren't many attackers out there that are specifically looking to disrupt wind energy. So really good cyber hygiene is one of the most important things that can be done to protect these plants.
How do you know that it was Russian hackers in that example?
I did not perform the analysis on that event. I'm just quoting from the reports that we read about it.
That's fair. You mentioned that cyber hygiene is the solution and that that's most commonly lacking in what we see in the industrial control system infrastructure. Why is that?
So, we see this type of challenge in many of the critical infrastructure areas. One example is municipal water and wastewater systems. Those entities tend to be smaller and less well funded because they're individual cities usually, and we see that with wind farms as well. They're often smaller startup companies that they're able to get a lease on land and they put some money in, they get investors to help them set up a wind farm, and they haven't done it before. They're new to the game. They don't understand all of the potential caveats, and their motivations are different than investors in a large natural gas plant would be. So because their economic incentives are a little different, cybersecurity isn't prioritized as highly much of the time. So they'll have some things that they miss, such as making sure they have physical security around all their turbines. They'll miss things like setting up defense in depth for their networks of ICS equipment surrounded by OT networks of control equipment, such as their control centers and substation interfaces and such. There are things that we've learned and we've implemented in other industries that are high priority, but it takes money and motivation of these private firms to improve their cybersecurity footprint. So wind isn't unique in that, but it is significant.
So money and motivation. Money being a small firm was already a challenge. Furthermore, tied to potential component of motivation is the resources to even understand and implement this correctly too, correct?
There's a big factor there as well, because if you haven't been in critical infrastructure and seen how things need to be done in large facilities where the risks are really high and they would present a big target to either hackers, whether they're ransomware or a nation state actor, they do things differently because they understand the risks, because there have been more high profile attacks on large entities. But if you don't know that, if your wind farm doesn't have somebody on the inside that understands that, why would you spend hundreds of thousands or millions of extra dollars that come out of your bottom line on security? So really, I think a big risk is people just don't understand the risks with these types of systems. I think that's starting to change as we have larger and larger energy companies that already understand cybersecurity jumping into wind. We have projects from Royal Dutch Shell and BP and other energy companies. They're setting up huge wind farms, especially offshore. They understand cybersecurity because of their refineries and pipeline systems, better than a startup does. And we hope we see more of that bring some maturity to the industry.
I would add that while there are some big players that do understand cybersecurity better, the information sharing for renewable energy especially, but for wind energy as well, is not very well established. So the knowledge that these big firms have about best practices may not be shared with the smaller firms, or incidents that happen for anyone are difficult to find. INL has done a lot of research on publicly available information for wind cybersecurity events. And while we know that there are more out there, there's very few publicly available details about some of these incidents. And as Keith mentioned, with a lot of the small firms, there's a lot more focus on just making things work, to get the bottom lines to work out. And there's just not very much motivation, both for manufacturers and for operators, to prioritize cybersecurity. A lot of the smaller plants will either keep their networks a little bit separate, or they're small enough as they are avoid some of the cybersecurity requirements that would apply for large power generation sources. So there are federal cybersecurity standards, but only for power generation sources of a certain size. So they may try to avoid having to meet those requirements. And then for the most part, their cybersecurity plans consist of meeting any requirements that apply to them, not really going above and beyond that, which may stem from the fact that, most people are not going to sit there and go, "Ooh, yeah, I think that the hackers are going to target wind today." So until we see more evidence of impacts from these types of attacks, there's not going to be as much motivation to do something about it.
So there is not an information sharing analysis center, an ISAC specifically set up for wind energy?
No, they would fall under the energy ISAC, the EISAC, but for the most part, that's not going to be focused on wind energy threats in particular.
So who else should have responsibility for supporting better information sharing for the most rapidly growing energy sector in the United States?
I think it's likely that there will get to be more standards, both in terms of technical standards and government mandated standards. We've seen just this year that there's been an increase in the reporting requirements for cybersecurity events for entities like pipelines. There is some of that reporting requirements already in the energy industry. But I think we'll see more of that. And I think that's one of the gaps that entities like INL are also trying to fill. So, we are doing the work to analyze these different setups and provide guides with best practices. Now, we have contacts with industry that we can share some of these with, and we can publish them, but we can't, in our particular position, really force people to put into practice these best practices. So I think what we're trying to do is make sure that the information is readily available and easy to understand for the stakeholders that need it. And then as that becomes more available to them, hopefully we'll see more adoption. And then from the standard side as well, as we get more general, I don't know if general understanding is the right word, but more cohesive understanding on what the technical implementation requirements are for executing these best practices, we'll see more technical standards that will help these companies do what they like to do, which is just manage compliance.
Keith, do you want to weigh in on that at all? Or
So the way that wind energy is directed into our grid is also a little different than some of the big multi-gigawatt power plants that we're used to seeing in the natural gas industry, and that's why the regulations are different. Right now, wind is used to augment, and when wind power is available, it pushes out into the grid, and things like frequency and voltages are regulated mostly by the big plants, like the nuclear or the big hydroelectric dams, and wind is just something that we add to the grid when it's available, or as it's available. Somewhere there's always wind, but as our percentage of wind generation increases, and solar along with it, I feel like naturally those things will become more regulated because they will actually have a bigger impact on grid security or grid stability. So I think we're just in an evolutionary point. We've seen already, the startup companies come in and build their wind farms and get a foothold in the door. We've seen large companies start to invest in large wind farms, and we're getting significant amounts of our energy from wind now that we didn't even 5 or 10 years ago. The next step is that wind and solar together become a much larger part of our energy portfolio, and naturally increased requirements from regulating bodies are going to come into play. And the industry itself is learning a lot about how to operate and what the risks may be. So I think we're just seeing an industry start from infancy and and become effective and learn how to grow. Right now, investment in wind is really attractive because for the amount of power that can be produced, it's very cost effective versus building a new natural gas fired generating plant. So I think we'll continue to see investment in wind, especially by big energy companies that are pivoting away from carbon producing energy to carbon free options. They're going to move their portfolios, but they'll bring with them the expertise they have. And also they'll be more on the radar of government entities and regulating entities that make sure that our power grid is stable and safe.
All right. These are the final questions. Okay. So, Megan, we'll start with you. If you could wave a magic, air-gapped, of course, wand, what is one thing you would change?
I think what I would change is the perception in the industry towards compliance versus security. It's been our experience that often compliance with requirements does not mean that you are secure. And I think there's a lack of understanding about what truly being secure means. So I'm not saying that I would wave my wand to make everything secure, but just to kind of close that understanding gap about compliance versus security. I mean, we know that standards and the government process tends to be behind the curve of technology. So just trying to close that gap a little bit and help people understand how they can be secure and what steps they can take that aren't necessarily, very costly, but can add a lot of security to the system just by following some other best practices.
Would you like me to answer the same question?
Yep. These are the thinking questions we end with.
Okay. So Megan's focus is so good. I really have to copy it, and I apologize. But the point that she made about compliance versus a security mindset and these entities desiring to set up systems that are secure and safe and that are well managed versus them being forced to do so, I think is a big deal. We're pivoting to renewables because we want to be good stewards of our planet. And we're finding that it's actually more cost effective in a lot of ways to do so rather than continuing to use older technologies and older energy sources such as coal that is rapidly shrinking in our energy portfolio. But we need to embrace as a culture or as a society, especially our large corporations and corporate entities that are responsible for making these investments. We need to embrace a security mindset. And it isn't just renewables and wind and solar that need to adopt this better. We have the same challenges across all critical infrastructure, from water to natural gas distribution to gasoline and diesel pipelines. Corporations have historically put profits first, and they're starting to learn about the security risks. But until that hits critical mass and it starts to hit their bottom line, like ransomware attacks, hitting the bottom line of entities. Luckily, ransomware attacks, they typically cause shortages, but they don't damage our infrastructure permanently. They don't harm people. Hopefully, the ransomware attacks and everything that's happening change the equation so people and corporations become more responsible, seeing that, hey, my investment in security is going to not only protect my bottom line, but I would hope everyone gets to the point that we care about our bottom line, but we also care about safety and security. People's lives and people's livelihoods are important, and we rely on these systems. So I think that naturally will come since renewables are getting bigger. But just as it took decades for a desire to be a little better stewards of the planet and consider renewables and get them into where they're now a significant part of our energy portfolio, it's going to take time to change the mindsets of companies and get them to be good security and stewards and make sure that they're contributing to the safety of our grid.
All right. You've waved your magic wand. Now, looking into the crystal ball for a 5-year prediction, one good and one bad thing.
So one good thing that would come from changing the security mindset of our renewables and other critical infrastructure would be that we would become more secure, and we would be able to have the type of management and security operations centers and visibility into networks that we need to make sure our adversaries are at least in check, and that we can prevent any catastrophic failures or damage to property, equipment, and even lives. But the bad thing that'll happen is new challenges will be invented and discovered by adversaries. There's always going to be a subset of society that wants to damage, destroy, or make money off of fear. So just magically waving a wand and having everything set up today in an ideal fashion isn't necessarily the answer. It's the mindset that drives you to put things into that situation. It's the mindset, thinking constantly about security, thinking constantly about safety. That mindset is what would really protect us long term, because the threats will evolve, the threats will change, the targets will be different this year than they are next year. But the mindset and the culture of our companies and our people is what's most important. So that kind is the good thing and the bad thing. The hackers will evolve and change. We have to change with them.
Megan, you ready?
Yeah. I think Keith put it very nicely. I think my good thing would be that we will see faster and more widespread adoption of renewable technologies. We know that there are some aggressive renewable portfolio standards out there that need wind energy and need solar energy to be a part of them if they're going to be met. So the carbon neutral and net zero targets for 2020 or for 2030 and 2050, both the federally mandated ones and these smaller state-run or business-run standards, those need wind. And if we see security issues with these technologies, if we're not staying up to date with the curve of technology, then I think it's going to be a lot harder to adopt those technologies. There's going to be a lot more policy barriers to that kind of technology. So if we can, implement the best practices and use the security mindset to stay on top of that, I think we will have a lot more success with adoption of renewable technology. I agree with Keith entirely that our adversaries will continue to evolve with us. I think one thing that's not going away is ransomware. We briefly mentioned, I think, that ransomware tends to not have a physical damage element to it as much. It's usually more of an IT system compromise that sometimes compromises the ability of a organization to operate its assets correctly. So that's what we saw with Colonial Pipeline earlier this year. It wasn't that their OT systems were hacked. It was just that the IT systems were so heavily relied on for the company's operation, particularly for their revenue streams, that shutting those down really forced the whole company to shut down. So I don't think we're going to see huge nation state actors targeting wind portfolios directly or intentionally focusing on wind. But I do think that we will continue to see a lot of OT environments exploited for financial gain, particularly through ransomware. So again, it kind of goes back to the good cyber hygiene and making sure that systems are patched and updated and that all the back doors are closed to try to prevent those types of ransomware attacks from having an impact on your system.
All right. Anything we didn't cover that you'd like to touch on?
Just a main point I want to make sure that we get across. There are unique challenges in wind and even solar and the renewable area of power generation, but they're not all new challenges. They're just a little bit different mix. Most of the challenges that we're seeing in wind related to cybersecurity, we see in bits and pieces in other entities too. I've mentioned a few examples such as pipelines and water and even large scale natural gas fired power plants. There's kind of commonality in what the risks are, and there's also a lot of commonality in how things are done across critical infrastructure. Wind isn't, more susceptible than any other type of energy. It's not immune, more than any other type of energy. We just need to be diligent about taking the lessons learned across the energy sector and others and implementing them systematically to make sure that the entire portfolio of technologies supporting the grid are safe.
All right. Well, I think that wraps it up then.
Thank you for listening to Hack the Plant, a podcast of the R Street Institute and ICS Village nonprofit. Subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends. Even better, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts so we can reach even more listeners. Tell us what you thought about it and who we should interview next by finding us on Twitter at RSI or at ICS_Village. Finally, if you want to know more about R Street or ICS Village, visit rstreet.org or icsvillage.com. I'm your host, Bryson Bort. Thank you to executive producer Tyler Lowe of Fader Creative, creative producer William Gray, and editor Dominic Sterrett of Sterrett Production.